A pyrrhic victory is a victory that inflicts such a devastating toll on the victor that it is tantamount to defeat. Such a victory negates any true sense of achievement or damages long-term progress. The phrase originates from Pyrrhus of Epirus, whose triumph against the Romans in the Battle of Asculum in 279 BCE destroyed much of his forces, forcing the end of his campaign. Dark Histories takes a dive into our top 3 pyrrhic victories. Number 3. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was an important battle during the Korean War. The battle took place about a month after the People's Republic of China entered the conflict and sent the People's Volunteer Army 9th Army to infiltrate the northeastern part of North Korea. On the 27th of November, 1950, the Chinese force surprised the U.S. 10th Corps commanded by Major General Edward Amund in the Chosin Reservoir area. A brutal 17-day battle in freezing weather soon followed. Between November 27 and 13 December, 30,000 United Nations Command troops under the field command of Major General Oliver P. Smith were encircled and attacked by about 120,000 Chinese troops under the command of Song Shirluan, who had been ordered by Mao Zedong to destroy the UN forces. The UN forces were nevertheless able to break out of the encirclement and to make a fighting withdrawal to the port of Hungnam, inflicting heavy casualties on the Chinese. The UN forces reported a total of 17,833 battle casualties. Despite the losses, the US X Corps preserved much of its strength. About 105,000 soldiers, 98,000 civilians, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 tons of supplies were shipped from Hungnam to Pusan, and they would later rejoin the war effort in Korea. Commanding General Smith was credited for saving the U.S. 10th Corps from destruction, while the 1st Marine Division, 41 Royal Marine Commando and RCT-31 were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for their tenacity during the battle. 14 Marines, 2 soldiers and 1 Navy pilot received the Medal of Honor, and all of the UN troops that served at Chosin were later nicknamed the Chosin Few. The Chinese 9th Army suffered a total of 48,156 casualties, about 1/3 of its total strength. The amount could have been as high as 60,000 based on replacement requests from the 9th Army. Regardless of the varying estimates of PLA, National Defense University noted that the 9th Army was put out of action for 3 months. With the absence of 9th Army, the Chinese order of battle in Korea was reduced from 30 infantry divisions in November to 18 by December 31, 1950. Whilst technically this was a tactical victory for China and its 9th Army, it was pyrrhic. It was the UN forces that managed to escape, make good their losses, and continue the war. The Chinese war effort was set back significantly, not to mention their massive casualties. Whilst they could replace their troops, the quality of those replacements would have been poor. Number 2. The Battle of Coral Sea. Battle of Coral Sea. With the attack at Pearl Harbor, the scene is set for an epic showdown between the world's 2 carrier fleet powerhouses, America and Japan. After a series of victories, Japan was on the offensive and looking to deliver a killer blow. The leader of their operations in the Pacific Theater, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, planned on drawing U.S. carriers into a decisive battle around Midway Island in June 1942. He first authorized Operation MO in April to isolate Australia by dispatching 2 separate invasion fleets to seize Tulagi, which was part of the Solomon Islands, and Port Moresby, a key supply point for Australian troops on New Guinea. Due to the work of their cryptographers, the same who learned of the Pearl Harbor attack before it happened, the Americans knew immediately about the plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz decided to dispatch the Navy's fleet carrier, the Lexington, and the more modern Yorktown to ambush the Japanese. The American ships would confront a Japanese screening force that grew to include the fleet carrier Shokaku and Zuikaku as well as the light carrier Shoho, commanded by Admiral Takeo Takagi. The 2 opposing carrier groups mustered nearly the same number of aircraft, 127 to 128 bombers and fighters. Japanese Marines seized Tulagi on May 3 without opposition, while the second force steamed for Port Moresby. The Japanese and American forces were aware of each other's presence in the Coral Sea, northeast of Australia, but did not know each other's exact location. What followed was the first carrier battle in history, and one where the opposing ships never entered each other's visual range. The challenges of this new form of warfare began with locating the moving enemy force amidst the vastness of the ocean. For 2 days, Japanese and American aircraft probed for the rival fleet's position but only received fragmentary reports for their efforts. In fact, the American fleet had stumbled in between the Japanese invasion force to the south and the carriers assigned to protect them, without either side being aware of how close they were to each other. Finally, at 8 a.m. on May 8, a Japanese scout detected what it believed to be a carrier and a heavy cruiser. At 9 a.m., 50 Japanese warplanes swooped down upon the ships reported by the scout plane, which were in fact the hapless U.S. destroyer Sims and the oiler Neosho. Both were quickly dispatched to the depths. By then, the American carriers had launched 93 aircraft towards a sighting of the Japanese amphibious fleet, which they thought was the main fleet. However, a ground-based B-17 bomber reported a new sighting at 10 a.m., and the aircraft were redirected. At 10:40 a.m., the Devastator and Dauntless bombers of the Lexington swooped down upon the Japanese light carrier Shoho, and at 11:35, less than an hour after the attack commenced, she became the first carrier lost by Japan in World War II. Only 203 of the 834 sailors and aviators aboard were rescued. The next morning, the Yorktown Strike Force found the Japanese fleet by 10:30, and the Lexington's planes followed an hour later. The two carrier wings dive bombers only managed to land 3 1,000-pound bombs on the Shokaku. But those strikes inflicted more than 220 casualties and crippled its flight deck. At noon she withdrew from the battle. Meanwhile, the Shokaku's own attack planes had struck the Lexington hard and managed 2 hits with their 1,870-pound Type 91 torpedoes, rupturing the huge ship's aviation gas storage, jamming both its elevators, and breaching the water main, necessitating the shutdown of several boilers. Minutes later, dive bombers struck the Yorktown once and the Lexington twice, blowing out a 5-inch gun turret on the latter and spraying shrapnel across its funnel. At noon, fires started on the Lexington when leaking gas vapors caused a store of aviation gasoline to erupt in a huge explosion, and a chain reaction of additional blasts slowly consumed the ship throughout the afternoon. One explosion blew the elevator a foot above the flight deck, and by 4 p.m. the below-decks area became entirely uninhabitable. The crew was forced to abandon her. She sank shortly thereafter. In purely material terms, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a Japanese victory. But it truly was a pyrrhic one. Despite the Japanese sinking a full-sized fleet carrier, they had lost more men and more aircraft. Whilst the Americans could replace their carriers, men and aircraft, the Japanese could not, and it set the tone for their loss at the Battle of Midway. Easily number 1. The Russian invasion of Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War that began in 2014. In that year, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, and Russian-backed separatists seized part of the Donbass region of southeastern Ukraine, consisting of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, sparking a regional war. On the 21st of February, 2022, Russia recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, two self-proclaimed breakaway quasi-states in the Donbass. The next day, Russian troops advanced on both territories. The invasion began on the morning of February 24, when Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, missiles and airstrikes hit across Ukraine, including the capital Kyiv. A large ground invasion followed from multiple directions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky enacted martial law and a general mobilization of all male Ukrainian citizens between 18 and 60, who were banned from leaving the country. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus towards Kyiv, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Luhansk and Donetsk. The advance towards Kiev was quickly checked by stubborn defense, and eventually the Russians withdrew from that axis. Instead, after a month of reorganization, they launched a renewed attack on the Donbass. This too faced huge defensive efforts and slowed to a crawl, with Luhansk eventually being captured 2 months later. The entire war has been punctuated by Russian assault, followed by steadfast defense and a continuing loss of men on both sides. A World War I-style battle of attrition. Certain tactical victories like the Battle of Mariupol have allowed Putin to declare a win, but the costs have been heavy. Casualties on the Russian side are estimated at up to 60,000 men killed or wounded, after just 6 months of battle. To put that into perspective, the Russians lost less than that in 10 years of war in Afghanistan. Not to mention the vast amounts of material, for example, up to 4,000 armored vehicles, 1,900 tanks, and 200 helicopters. Then there are the sanctions that have squeezed the life out of the Russian economy, making it harder to replace the machines for lack of material and items like sanctioned microchips. And for all these losses and being reduced to a pariah state, Russia currently controls just 20% of the Ukraine. Ukrainians, like any patriotic nation, holds the loss of territory as wholly unacceptable, and so this could be perceived as victory for Russia, but the cost is so big that it is without a doubt the best modern example of a pyrrhic victory.